Right, so I'm so pleased tonight to welcome our CEO and Executive Director, Judy Gradwell. Hi, Judy.
Good evening and welcome. I'm glad you're all able to join us for tonight's presentation, the Monarch, the Bumblebee, and the Canary in the Coalmine. And we're thrilled to see so many nature lovers joining us online. I'm President and CEO of San Diego Natural History Museum, and although our building is closed again for the time being, our work to research and preserve and share the natural history of our amazing region continues. And the tickets you purchased tonight, the donations, the Facebook shares, and all the help, all that help to support our work. So thank you for helping us to keep our mission alive while our doors are closed. We're looking forward to reopening as soon as it's safe to do so, but until that time, we're going to continue to bring natural history to you in your homes. If you're a fan of insects and tonight's talk, you won't want to miss our next lecture, Never Home Alone, on July 28th. In this talk, Dr. Rob Dunn, who wrote the book, will introduce us to the insects, arthropods, and microbes with whom we are sharing our homes while we shelter in place. On Tuesday, August 11th, you can practice your Spanish in what may be the museum's first ever Spanish language panel. In this talk, 5 conservation experts from Baja California will discuss the importance of research expeditions with a focus on a recent trip to the fragile island ecosystem of the Revillagigedos archipelago off Baja. And it's a fascinating area. If you don't speak Spanish, you can join us the following Tuesday on August 18th, where Dr. Sula Vanderplank, one of the researchers on this expedition, will discuss the trip in English, touching on invasive species, climate change, and a special wasp specimen that she collected from inside her own nose. You won't want to miss that one. If you want to keep learning in between talks, join us on the museum's Facebook page for live trivia games every Friday night at 7. And questions span the category of sports, pop culture, and of course, science. We've also added plenty of digital resources for families to our website, and visit the education tab on our site for crafts, games, videos, so you can explore natural history from your own home. And in order to stay up to date on all this online programming, follow us on Instagram at the handle @SDNHM and on the Facebook page for the San Diego Natural History Museum. Tonight's program is the 3rd in our series of online presentations since we've been moving online, and we are fervently hoping that the technology gods continue to smile on us. Please bear with us if we run into any difficulties, and don't hesitate to ask for help in the Q&A box. If you're unfamiliar with the webinar format, as we've been saying, your microphone and your camera are disabled, so you can be as disheveled as you want for this particular event. The 2019-2020 season of Nat Talks is made possible by presenting sponsor the Downing Family Foundation and media partner KPBS, the public media stations serving San Diego and Imperial counties. And we're thrilled to present tonight's talk, to see so many Bumblebee and Monarch fans in the audience. Of course, they're among our most charismatic insects, but San Diegans go far beyond just merely admiring them. A Union Tribune article from yesterday reported that local nurseries are selling out of the milkweed that supports monarch populations. And I was just confessing, I ordered 3 plants online. They're supposed to be here this week. And if you don't already count yourself among butterfly and bumblebee benefactors, Michael's talk will surely light a fire under you. Dr. Michael Wall has served as a curator of entomology at the Nat for the past 14 years. Like many museum professionals, he wears many hats, and since 2008, he has served as vice president for the Museum of Science and Conservation. He's passionate about collections-based research and regional exploration. He got his bachelor's and master's degrees in botany at Auburn University before converting to the dark side of entomology for his PhD at the University of Connecticut. While working on his PhD, he received a Fulbright fellowship to study at the Australian National Museum in Sydney, where he returned for a postdoc prior to coming to San Diego. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy Michael's talk and be sure to enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'll be reading them and posing them to Michael at the end of the talk. So sit back and enjoy Michael Wall.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Glad you could join us here this evening. Get this going up here. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk to you about monarch butterflies, bumblebees, and canaries in a coal mine. And but I want to start this talk off by talking about this incredible mustache. The bearer of this mustache is John Scott Haldane. And for the evolutionary biologists and population geneticist folks that are out there in the audience, this is your Haldane's father. He was a Scottish physician, a physiologist, and obsessed with respiration and the impacts of chemicals and air pressure on the respiratory system. In addition to being considered the father of oxygen therapy, Haldane invented the black veil respirator, progenitor of the gas mask during World War I, and very on the nose for where we are today. And this will be my first and last pitch to tell you to remember to wear a mask. And it was Haldane that introduced the idea of the canary in a coal mine as an indicator for carbon monoxide poisoning. So while I'll grant you that Canary in a Coal Mine is a far less problematic song by the Police than Don't Stand So Close to Me, in this context, the cliche represents a sentinel species or an indicator species that, that indicates something that might not be readily obvious. So you got a dead canary in a coal mine, there's something wrong with the air in that mine, and you better get out of Dodge unless you want to end up like the canary. And so tonight we're going to talk about two things beyond the glory of that mustache we saw in the first slide there, and two potential canaries, the monarch butterfly and bumblebees, and what they might be telling us generally about biodiversity decline in this big old coal mine of a planet we're living on right now. But first, let's get to know these critters. But also first, as a caveat, in the immortal words of one of my heroes, Willy Wonka, so much time and so little to do. Wait a minute, strike that, reverse it. Because seriously, an entire symposium could be held about monarch butterflies themselves or bumblebees. They're quite possibly some of the most popular and recognizable insects in North America, and we have so little time, so things are going to be very superficial here. One of the reasons why monarchs are so well known and capture the imagination of people is because of their migratory behavior and the amazing images that we might have seen in National Geographic of overwintering populations in the mountains of Mexico, where they aggregate in high numbers, enough to make like the tree branches actually bow under the weight of how numerous they can be. And but one thing we have to understand is that while monarchs are one biological species, they're divided into at least two major populations. There's an east of the, I got to turn on my little laser pointer here for you. An east of the Rockies population that we see here, and it migrates annually to and fro these overwintering grounds in central Mexico. And then we have a west of the Rockies population that migrates to and from overwintering populations in coastal California. But you'll also notice over here this little weird purple bit in Florida. And this is where there are some non-migratory populations, what we might call resident populations in Florida. And so they don't move to and fro, they don't migrate, there's no overwintering, they're there year round. And we're gonna come back and they're gonna come into play later in the talk. Oops, there we go. So let's talk about their life cycle. and keep in mind as we're talking, I might be referring back and forth between these east and west populations. So I'll try to draw that out whenever I do that. Monarchs are very much like Eric Carle's very hungry caterpillar. They start their life cycle and will start their life cycle with a pregnant female flying north from central Mexico and hunkering down at some of the first sort of place where she might find a potential host plant. It might be southern Texas or northern Mexico, or maybe even up in Oklahoma. And she's flying around and she's trying to find a plant on which to lay an egg. And surprise, surprise, when she finds that plant, she lays an egg. And you can see one right there, and there it is all blown up for you. But not any old plant's gonna do. No, the females, they want to lay eggs on milkweed plants, generally in the genus Asclepius, but they will take some other things and closely related. But why milkweed plants? Why not, an oak tree or something like that? And this has to do with the milky sap that gives milkweed plants their names. It contains this chemical called cardiac glycosides that are toxic to most critters, but monarchs have these special enzymes in them that help suppress that toxicity. And so they then in turn store those toxins internally. And if you're gonna be toxic, then you might as well tell the world about it. So no predators mistake you for tasty caterpillars. And so we see the striking coloration on these caterpillars that have been developing and going through a variety of molts until they go through the process of pupation, where they'll form a chrysalis, which in my opinion is the closest thing to a bona fide miracle in nature. And it's where the process, of course, metamorphosis occurs. You can actually even see within this one, the wings of the developing adult that are within here. And then we get back to the other side, a beautiful butterfly. And this cycle will happen 3 or 4 more times, or 3 more times before the members of that 4th generation will then return and go back to their overwintering grounds. And so what you're seeing is that you can think about as the season progresses, right? In the very early spring, Texas is warmer, has milkweeds growing in it. And then as the season progresses more, okay, the milkweeds start to sprout in Missouri and then more. And so they're moving up the continent as the season progresses to get these fresher milkweed resources, and they'll make it all the way up to Canada for this 4th generation, and then they fly all the way back down to Mexico at that point. So that's sort of their life cycle, but let's talk a little bit about their population decline, because this is the sort of the canary and the coal mine idea, is that our monarch butterflies and bumblebees telling us something about the world and biodiversity in general. And monarchs certainly are. They're at least telling us about themselves, because we are seeing dramatic population decline in monarchs. But this is where we do have to divide up between the East Coast and West Coast populations. And so this scene from central Mexico, where you get these ginormous numbers of overwintering butterflies, these represent essentially the East Coast population's overwintering grounds. And what scientists have been doing with at least some regimented effort since 1993 is to monitor the total forest area occupied by monarch colonies. So they measure this just in area. They're not out there counting every single one of the monarchs that are out there. But we can see over time, sure, there's ups and downs, and there's bad years and there's good years, but the prevailing trend line for these overwintering sites is this downward trend. Despite a fairly decent year last year, we're kind of back to where we were in the year before in this current year. So there's this overall general decline in these overwintering numbers down in central Mexico. Now let's flip over to the West Coast. And so here we are, this is probably somewhere up like around Pacific Grove, where we have our West Coast populations overwintering grounds where they like to overwinter in Monterey pines and a variety of other trees along the coastal areas that have just the right habitat. And since 1997, the Xerces Society has been doing a monarch Thanksgiving count. And then more recently, they've also added a New Year's count because they want to see how they're doing at Thanksgiving, which is right when kind of they're all getting established in their overwintering site. And then they're also looking at these sites in January to see how they have actually overwintered. But this is the data from their Thanksgiving count. And you can see again, you know, obviously this really high number here, but a general trend line down and some particularly devastatingly low numbers in our most recent years here. And what this blue line represents is basically you can think of it as the amount of effort, the number of sites that they went to. And the dramatic thing here, right, is that the number of sites, the amount of effort is going up. And you would hope to see that as effort for finding things goes up, that you would also find more things. But that's simply not the case here. And so we're seeing these declines in both our East Coast populations and our West Coast populations. And this was enough to concern the folks that are working on monarchs from a conservation and research perspective to petition the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2014 to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. And so that petition is still under review. I believe the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has said that they will be making a decision in December of this year. And so we'll see that may or may not get kicked, that can might get kicked down the road again, but we'll see. Hopefully we'll know more in December of this year. So why are monarchs declining? I see them outside my window all the time. You know, they seem to be doing well from everything I can tell, but yet we're seeing these declining numbers in these overwintering areas. And there's some great research, and you'll see me mention this organization over and over again, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They've been doing some wonderful research where they've been trying to assess particularly the Western monarch population crashes and what were the causes and what are some of the recommended actions that we can take. And we'll be talking about all those things as the talk progresses. But one of the main things that comes out of it is this idea of intensive agriculture being a problem. And so intensive agriculture means a lot of things. It means habitat destruction, right? Because these areas where we've got fields might once upon a time been an area where there could have been a lot of, you know, native milkweeds growing up in those areas. Intensive agriculture, along with it, brings the application of pesticides. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But it also brings the application of herbicides. And you might go, well, Michael, how are herbicides a problem for monarch butterflies? But we have to remember they're very specific host biology, right? And so there's a lot of crops these days that are in rotation being used that are what we call Roundup ready crops. And so Roundup ready means that they've been genetically modified in some sort of way to be able to endure being sprayed with Roundup, which would otherwise kill most plants. And so these Roundup ready crops are planted. It means you can use Roundup pretty indiscriminately. And so what that ends up doing is being a really effective weed killer. Well, milkweeds, as the name suggests, milkweed, are weeds in agricultural fields. And so there have been some studies that have taken place, one decent one that was done in Iowa, where they looked at the reduction in common milkweed in croplands between 1909 and 2009. And they found that there were really low densities of common milkweed in approximately 50% of the Iowa corn and soybean fields in 2009. And in 1999, they found that there was about 50% in the corn in soybean fields. But then in 2009, this number was declined down to 8% of the surveyed fields. And so we see here how this relationship between herbicides has this negative impact on insects, and in this case, in particular, with monarchs. And this is sort of hot off the presses research that came out in June of 2020, where researchers looked at pesticide contamination on milkweeds across all sorts of landscapes in Northern California. And this is kind of, there's a lot of big, weird, gross words here, but these are all different types of insecticides that we see here. And what we see on this bottom area are the different areas that they sampled. So they were sampling all these milkweeds from agricultural areas, refuge areas. So we're talking about reserves, natural areas. This is retail, so shops, and then in urban settings like your backyard. And they were looking for the presence of all these different insecticides. They also looked at herbicides and fungicides and a variety of other things. And what's really disturbing to see about this is that some of these pesticides are just across the board present everywhere, including in these what we consider to be refuge areas, or these native habitats. And so, what these white dots are numbers show is that that is not only just a high concentration, because that's what the dark color means, but if it's got a white dot in there, then that means it's so high that it is considered to be very dangerous for the monarch caterpillars that are developing. And so we have these pesticides that are not just being used in agricultural settings, but clearly there's blowover into other adjacent areas that are causing problems for our cute little orange friends. Now, there we go. We can't, it's easy, to be living in suburban or urban California and shake our fingers at agriculture for being part of the problem. But when we look across the landscape of California, we see that we're part of the problem too, right? Because this is a highly fractured landscape that once upon a time would have contained natural habitat in which there would have been milkweeds growing, the source and the food plant for our monarch friends. And so clearly habitat fragmentation through agriculture, but also very much through habitat conversion associated with all sorts of human development, growth, urbanization, suburbanization, tract homes, etc., sort of thing. Another interesting, sort of maybe a little bit more obscure issue that monarch butterflies are dealing with is this thing that everybody in the biz just refers to it as OE, because none of us can pronounce the scientific name, Ophriocistus, and I'm not going to try that last one. But OE is a protozoan parasite that infects monarchs, and what you're seeing are the spores for this parasite that were picked up off of the abdomen of this critter by using just a little bit of slightly sticky tape and then looking at it underneath a microscope. And so you can see the scales of the butterfly here. And an infected monarch might have millions of spores on its body, and as it flies around and is laying eggs, it scatters those onto the leaves that it is associated with. And then when the caterpillar eats those leaves, the spores get inside them where the parasite replicates inside of them. And heavily infected individuals might not ever even emerge from their pupa, or they might emerge but be too weak to fully expand their wings. And I have people contacting me regularly about, I found a butterfly and maybe only half of its wings have expanded, and they want to know what they can do about it. And unfortunately, there's not a lot that we can do about it. But monarchs with milder infections can come out of this on the other side, have fully formed wings, and they might appear normal, but they're often, it's been shown that their wings are weaker. They have like kind of a lower tensile strength. And there's also other negative, less than lethal effects. So, that's bad. But the interesting thing is that the prevalence of this parasite load differs over geographic space. And so in the eastern population, we have lowish numbers of sort of parasite load or parasite density. In the west coast, we have medium-ish loads of parasite density or preponderance. But this is where we come back to our little purple population down here, our resident populations in Florida, where we get really high levels of parasite load. And so the hypothesis is that the migratory process of flying down to Mexico, or maybe you're in the West Coast and you're up in Canada and you're flying down to Pacific Grove, that migratory process acts as a filter that screens out infected individuals. And that's the reason why we see the populations that have the longest migration with the lowest parasite loads, medium migration, medium parasite, no migration, high parasite load. And it's, okay, well, that's interesting, but what are the practical implications of this? And this is where a very specific recommendation for us folks in Southern California comes into play, because we are inadvertently creating resident populations like those in Florida by planting tropical non-native milkweeds and allowing them to flower year-round. And this inadvertently encourages the monarchs not to migrate. And you've had to have noticed this, right? I mean, even if you don't plant these in your own garden, but you know, are walking through Balboa Park, we have resident monarch butterflies that don't seem to be going up to Pacific Grove. And one of the reasons why we have that is because we have created this sort of artificial system in which they are able to hang around. But because of that, we're taking away that natural filter and increasing parasite prevalence within our populations. And so we're going to come back around to, because, you know, everybody's got goodwill and everybody wants to do the right thing, and we're going to come back around to what you can do about this if you have a lot of tropical milkweed that you like to plant in your yard because you want to supply food to these critters. We'll talk about ways that you can continue to do that, but encourage them to fly north, young monarch. So smash cut 2. Let's talk about bumblebees for a little bit and another oversimplified introduction. So real quick, there's lots of different types of bees in the world. There's a Dr. Seuss book that is dying to be written about blue bees and red bees and green bees and bees' knees that are out there. But of all those bees, there are about 16,000 on a global basis. And 16,000. About 1,600, 10% of those live in our fair California. And in San Diego County, because of the great work of James Hung, who was a former graduate student up at David Hallway's lab at UCSD, we know that we have over 600 species in San Diego County. That's often mind-blowing to folks to think about 600 species of bees in San Diego County. And on a global basis, of all of those bees that are out there, depending on who you talk to, the number hovers around there being 250 species of bumblebees worldwide. And bumblebees have an interesting distribution relative to lots of groups of animals. They really handle colder climates well. And so what you see, this is basically the Tibetan Plateau here. And then we get up into the Tinshin Mountains, and then the Caucasus and the Carpathians and the Alps over here. Really hot. My dog's freaking out behind me, sorry. They really like these high elevation areas and high latitudinal areas, and very much not down in the tropics, or at least not high diversity in the tropics. And where we do sort of see them, they tend to be high elevation areas in the tropics. So they tend to like the colder climates, which is a little bit unusual. So we have about 47 species known from north of Mexico, and 30 of those species are found west of the Rockies. And this is a poster that's put up by the U.S. Forest Service that you can find online if you want to print one up for your own education. And so let's talk a little bit about their life cycle. And of course, we are going to start off like we did last time with a pregnant female. And she's just spent the winter spirited away somewhere in a hidey hole of sorts all by herself and waiting for the spring to get warm enough for her to come out and start foraging around for nectar and pollen and a place to live or a hive. And often they use rodent burrows or other pre-existing holes in the ground. And in that hole, she will establish a nest. And much like a honeybee, rear infertile daughters, so daughters that can't lay eggs, to forage for food and take care of the hive while she converts over to being really a pampered queen, an egg-laying machine. And over the summer, that hive will get bigger and bigger, but it never tops out to more than maybe hundreds of workers. Whereas when we're talking about honeybees, normally they will have tens of thousands of workers. And so as the chill of fall hits the air, the queen will lay some eggs that are going to be destined to be future queens and some destined to become males. And once they emerge, they're booted from the nest and we get to a love story, a Hollywood tear-jerking romance of sorts where a boy meets girl, they get along well enough to mate, and then the boy dies. A very short-lived one-trick pony. That's the end of the male's life. And then that queen, inseminated queen, in our story of star-crossed lovers, will then forage for nectar for a little while to store up some energy, and then find a place to spend the winter solo to start it all over again the following year. So in addition to that lifestyle that I just shared with you, this is a special kind of bumblebee, and they're called cuckoo bumblebees. And they are brood parasitic. If you've heard of cuckoo birds, they're very much like cuckoo birds, in which these queen cuckoo bumblebees will aggressively invade the nest of other bumblebee species. They'll kill the resident queen and then start laying their own eggs, which are cared for by the resident workers. And so she doesn't produce any workers. All she does is produce more queens and males. So there's these interesting sort of critters that are out there gaming the system. But some of the species that are considered to be the most threatened actually are these cuckoo bees. So let's talk a little bit very briefly about bumblebee population decline. And you might have seen this. This came out in February of 2020. When I was looking through this thinking, oh, that was just the other day. But then I realized that time has lost all meaning and that was actually some time ago. But this came out, it's based on a study that was published in Science earlier this year, where they were looking at the decline of bumblebees on a worldwide basis. But this study, while it got some notoriety and got in the news sources, it wasn't new for the specialists that were out there. Since 1982, folks in Great Britain have been looking at the decline of bumblebees. And even in this article, Paul Williams, who's considered to be one of the bumblebee experts in the world, refers back to even earlier articles from the 50s and the 70s where people were concerned about the decline of bumblebees. But it's not just a British thing. There's been plenty of studies that have taken place here in North America looking at the decline of bumblebees throughout North America in general, and some very species-specific declines. And in particular, one species became the first bumblebee listed on the endangered species. This happened, I believe, in 2017, where the rusty-patched bumblebee was officially listed as endangered. And currently, there is a petition out for 3 species from California, one of which you can find in San Diego, to receive protection under the state's endangered species list. And so that I think initially the solicitation for that went out in June of last year, so 2019, and that's still under review. It has gotten tied up in the courts, but the process is still taking place. So why the decline in bumblebees? And it's gonna be like same, what is it? I'm looking for the same song, different verse, but the chorus is the same. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say for the Monarchs, because we see a lot of the same themes reemerging. Great review article that was put out in 2008 by some of the hotshots in the bumblebee biology and conservation world, where they identified agricultural intensification, right? We've seen that one before. Impact of non-native bees, and we're going to talk a little bit about this one in particular, but habitat fragmentation, we talked about that, right, with the monarch butterflies, and how habitat fragmentation can be bad for population structure. It can sort of make the bees inbred and make them more susceptible to things that might impact them, like disease or extenuating weather circumstances. And then also climate change was identified in this as being the reasons for their decline. I just want to highlight a few articles that I think are particularly interesting that drive home some points. And this one has to do with the idea of intensive agriculture, because bumblebees are clearly beneficial in terms of pollination services. And in fact, bumblebees are used as domesticated pollinators in greenhouse tomato growing. So they will actually bring bumblebees in a box into a greenhouse in order to pollinate greenhouse tomatoes. But with this research that happened in Northern California was looking at was that they, wanted to look at, okay, well, how are these bees, these wild bees, not these bumblebees in a box, but how are these wild bees helping agriculture? And how does it differ across sort of a natural landscape or a hybrid combined landscape of natural and agricultural ecosystems? And they found lots of cool things in this article. And the bee that they mostly focused on is pictured right here. It's called the yellow-faced bumblebee. This is the fancy scientific name of it here, and you can see that this axis has abundance on it, and then the percent of natural habitat within foraging distance. And so the more natural habitat that's within foraging distance, the more bumblebees that you have that are out there. And this really makes sense when we reflect back on the biology of these bumblebees, because remember, where do they nest? Well, they predominantly nest in burrows underneath the ground. And you're not going to find a lot of burrows underneath the ground in fields that are being tilled on a regular basis, or at least not when those bumblebees need those burrows underneath the ground in the early spring. And so because of that, they have to have access to these areas that are not being disturbed that way. And so these might come in the form of hedgerows or natural habitat. So they need it for a place to live, but also for alternative food sources, because just like you and I, like if I just ate tomatoes all day, or a bumblebee just ate tomato pollen all day, then that might not necessarily be so great. So a diversified portfolio of food is good for the stability of the hive, just like a diversified portfolio of food in your refrigerator is good for your tummy. Now, remember, one of those threats that they mentioned was the introduction of non-native bees, and then in parentheses I wrote, in particular, pathogen spillover, which is such a fun little thing to say, pathogen spillover. And the pathogens that bumblebees have to worry about are things like this tracheal mite that you can see here, but also various types of protozoans and microsporidians and nematodes, and there's at least one virus that causes deformed wings. But these are all things that tend to be higher in domesticated populations of critters, because when we domesticate critters, we bring them all together. They're in high densities, and whenever things are in high densities, just like, you know, meningitis is more likely to crop up on college campuses because of the high density of people on the college campuses. All of these sort of parasites are more likely to have higher densities within these managed, crowded, domesticated systems. And so that's, okay, well, that's bad for those bumblebees, but those are domesticated bumblebees. What about the wild bumblebees? And this was some research that I believe, this was up in Canada, where they looked at pathogen spillover from commercial to wild populations. And so what they're showing here is the proportion of infected individuals of these various sorts of protozoans and microsporidians that are over here. But the numbers that they're showing are for the wild bees, not the bees that are inside the greenhouses, but the wild bees that were collected around those greenhouses. And so what you can see is that there is this pathogen spillover, that if you're in an area where there are a lot of contagious bees that are out there, then yes, your likelihood of becoming a carrier for these parasites becomes an issue as well, relative to these more sort of natural ecosystems that they sample. So, you know, a wide variety of reasons impacting the potential decline. We didn't really address climate change here, but we can talk about that in the Q&A as well, because there are a variety of studies that have to do with climate change and bumblebees in particular. But I need to move on now to why I think you should care, okay? And we can care because things have intrinsic value. That's one reason why we can care, right? You know, it's easy to care and believe that panda has intrinsic value for some reason. You know, I'm getting ready to go into a rant about like that pandas aren't any more special than a monarch butterfly, but I get it that they're cute and fuzzy and they got big human-like eyes, and we naturally have an affinity towards them. And we've got cute and fuzzy critters that are insect critters that are out there as well, but they don't have human-like eyes, and they've got too many legs, and they've got all these things going against them that makes it difficult for us to identify with insects. But yet we could believe that they have intrinsic value, and we should care because their numbers are declining, and that that we ostensibly are impacting the decline of those numbers. But enough with that softy gushy stuff, right? Like let's focus on what's in it for us as human beings. And that's where we get into this concept of ecological services. And particularly, let's put dollars on it. Let's think about the economic value of those ecological services. This is an old study from 2006, where they estimated that the annual value of ecological services provided by insects was at least $57 billion. And so I actually looked this up. I always love to go to the Fortune 500 list and figure out where the insects of North America would be on the Fortune 500 list. And it puts them in the mid-50s, right around where Disney is. And if you just did a very conservative extrapolation of that across the globe, then you would get up to like 350 billion on a global basis. And that means they're starting to run with the big dogs like Walmart. So there's a lot of economic value for these ecological services. But Michael, do tell me, what are these ecological services that you speak of? And, you know, the obvious one is pollination. The United States, there's over 100 crops that require or at least benefit from having pollinators around in order to set fruit. And it's valued at billions of dollars in addition to making a tasty salad. You look at my pickled okra right here. This is a salad that I ate about 2 weeks ago, I believe. And so clearly the pollination services, they're putting food into our refrigerators. It would be a very not tasty world if we lost the pollination services of these insects. Oh, my dog is barking. But that's like, okay, you got your bee here and you got your butterfly here. Okay, they're pollinators, maybe more or less. But what about these other things, Michael? There's a fly up here. We don't need flies, right? Or grasshoppers or beetles or dragonflies. What are the ecological services that they're providing? But, you know, think about it. Think about if you've got a horrible neighbor that doesn't pick up its dog's poop from your yard when it comes by. Well, you don't want to pick it up. What's going to happen to that dog poop? Is it just going to stay petrified there forever? No, some insects are going to come take care of it eventually for you. And so these ecological services of decomposition are critical to keeping us from being up to our eyeballs and you know what, and all sorts of other things. And then also, you know, you look at a grasshopper, and this one in particular looks like that could do some serious damage to crops. And there's no denying the fact that insects are pests on crops. But insects are also out there feeding on a variety of plants, native plants that are out there or plants that are in your garden. And then those insects become food for maybe things that we care a little bit more about or that we can identify a little bit more with. And so we don't call California gnat catchers because they like to eat sunflower seeds. They're gnat catchers. And so there's all sorts of birds that are out there that are dependent upon the insect world in order to maintain their life cycle. Fishermen don't learn how to tie flies because flies like to eat water lilies. And so the sports fishing, the freshwater sports fishing industry is very dependent upon freshwater insects. And this is why you see a lot of groups like Trout Unlimited are strong conservation advocates for clean water because of this. But I want to give you one example of some research that was done locally that to me is super fascinating and really sort of drives home why something that you might think is gross and ugly has value for humans. And so this is work that comes out of UCLA, and what they found was that invasive crayfish lead to more mosquitoes and risk of disease in Southern California. And I just want to walk you through this. You know, there are no native crayfish here in Southern California. They've all got imported in either as bait or as food at some point in time, yet they've taken over a lot of our streams and areas. And when we enter into this sort of aquatic ecosystem, our native dragonfly nymphs, so this is a baby dragonfly, not the prettiest critter on the face of the planet, but this baby dragonfly larva is really great at eating mosquitoes. But crayfish stink at eating mosquitoes. They're not good at it. But crayfish are great at eating dragonfly larvae. And so you can predict where this story is going to go next, right? That if you take the dragonflies out of the mix because the greedy crayfish ate them all up, then all of a sudden you're going to start having more mosquitoes out in the ecosystem. And this is exactly what the field work has shown. And we all know that we don't like mosquitoes, but we particularly don't like mosquitoes when they are carrying human diseases, vectoring human diseases, which certainly is the case. There's been cases of West Nile virus, and there's other things that we fear could be on the cusp of being here as well that are vectored by mosquitoes. And so what we've witnessed here is the crashing of a disruption of a natural ecosystem where a non-native critter is driving out the native critters, and then we're seeing a buildup of the things that we really don't want, that we want to be controlled at some level. And so how do we respond? We respond through the use of pesticides, which of course is going to have a cascading impact on all the other native critters that are in these ecosystems. And so you've probably seen this headline, the insect apocalypse is here, you know, and I truly do think that the monarchs and the bumblebees are a canary in a coal mine. They're waving the flag for something that we are more broadly seeing And just a few examples of some of the interesting research that people have been doing on this. I love this one because it's just so intuitive and familiar. This researcher, over the course of 22 years, did these like very controlled drives across Denmark and monitored the abundance of insects using his windshield, the good old car splat test. And this is something that folks who've driven around for, at least 2 or 3 decades, probably you've noted this on yourself, that you're just not wiping away the windshields quite as much as you used to. And he correlated that with the decline of insectivorous birds as well. Another recent study was done where mayfly numbers dropping in half since 2012. And they can actually monitor, the mayflies can be so numerous that they can monitor them with weather radar. And so they were able to put all this stuff together to monitor this decline. And just to give you an idea of how common or how numerous these mayflies could be, this was back in 1966 on a bridge across the Mississippi River. And what looks like a snow of mayflies is indeed that. And that is to most people very repulsive, and I get it, ooh, gross, there's a whole bunch of insects there. But what that represents from an ecosystem perspective is clean water, lots of energy, lots of food for the fish in the water, and you can see them all laying right there. Well, if they weren't, you can imagine all around the Mississippi River, these are laying on the ground, and this becomes food for terrestrial ecosystems as well. And so having these numbers cut in half is just insanely dramatic. So what can we do? There's a lot of things that we can do. But one is protect and create natural-like, and I should have put that in parentheses, natural-like habitat. And we'll get to what I mean with that in just a second. But particularly for us West Coast folks who are worried about our West Coast populations of the monarch butterfly, protecting and enhancing those overwintering sites is critical, that we can't see more declines in the spaces that are available for these overwintering populations. So we want to make sure that we're protecting that habitat, but also providing lots of habitat outside of those areas where they can find food plants, native milkweeds, etc. And yes, you can plant a native pollinator garden of sorts, or a milkweed garden of sorts, and that's going to create habitat within your urban setting. But remember, here's where we come back to our tropical milkweed, and that by creating this habitat, we are contributing to the delinquency of these monarch butterflies in terms of them not migrating back to their overwintering areas and creating these resident populations where we get buildups of these parasites, which are going to be detrimental to the population. And so the natural-like part of this, at least when it comes to monarch butterflies, is the recommendation that that you cut back your tropical milkweeds in the fall, so October and November of every year, and keep doing that repeatedly and not let them kind of come back until the spring, at the same time in which we would expect to find our native milkweeds proliferating. So ideally, obviously, plant native plants first. But if you can't find them and you can't help yourself, then make sure that you're treating those tropical milkweeds in a way that makes them feel a little bit more like they belong in Southern California. And I can't emphasize this idea enough of non-native plantings, or native plantings as opposed to non-native plantings. And this is work that was done on the East Coast, obviously, and I'm looking forward to working with some people locally about thinking about this in Southern California and how it might apply to us and the best practices and so forth. But what they did here was that they looked at the proportion of non-native plants versus native plants and how that impacted insects and how that arthropod abundance, that insect abundance, impacted resident Carolina chickadees, and definitely saw that there was a reduction in, these cute little critters that we might feel much more sympathy for than insects, that they are being impacted by these cascading effects of not having native plants and the native insects associated with those native plants. Clearly, we need to reduce pesticide and herbicide use. There's ways in which you can do that with your dollar, by trying to purchase things that are organic or are using reduced pesticides, but also, very much think about this in your own home and garden situation, because this idea of sort of urban drool or runoff of pesticide and herbicides from urban settings is very real, and there's been some good research that has been done on it, where they've seen exactly this: the urban use of pesticides is getting down into the water systems. It's messing around with our native invertebrate assemblages and disrupting these ecosystems. This is the fun part. Get your community science game on, okay? Because if you want to do community science, boy, there is no shortage of ways to get involved. And particularly now in COVID-19 world, trying to get your kiddos outside so that they can have some interesting learning experiences in a safe environment. There's a lot of promise available for you here, and I'm just going to cover a few of them really quick. There's the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. This is a easy one where they ask you to submit photographs of milkweeds and monarch butterflies. Super simple, straightforward. This is one of my personal favorites. This is the Project Monarch Health Project, where they will send you little kits to test for that parasite that I was talking to you about. And they have videos on how to handle the butterflies, etc., where you can pick up those spores and then you send it back to University of Georgia and they'll add it to the data that they have. I highly recommend you check out their website. And did hear a speaker from this group talk, and they are looking for more data from Southern California. So this is a real way that you can help fill in some data gaps for this group. Just a little ways up the road at Cal Poly, there's a great program called Monarch Watch that you can get involved with. You can see this monarch right here. See, it's got a little circle on it. It's got a little tag. So tag monarch butterflies so that they can look at the migration patterns of monarchs and where they're coming from when they come to overwintering sites. So more information on their website. The Xerces Society has their Western Monarch count. Those were those graphs that I was showing you earlier for the Western monarchs. And you can certainly sign up to become a monitor as part of that. We do have historic sites in San Diego where monarchs overwintered. And we certainly could use more folks to go out and survey, but you heard me emphasize that we have historic sites. It's been a while since people have seen overwintering monarchs, at least in some of these historic sites. And so you gotta feel it in your heart that you're okay with going out and coming up with negative data, but negative data is important data. And then on the Bumblebee front, there are actually a lot of international programs as well, but I just want to highlight the NAT. We have a Bumblebees of San Diego County project on iNaturalist that I encourage you to submit photographs to. The museum offers iNaturalist trainings all the time that you can find out about online if you're not familiar with iNaturalist. And but it's a way in which we can sort of monitor the diversity and which species are where in San Diego County, at least. Number 4, in terms of what you can do, you can educate yourself. This talk is, right, like I said at the very beginning, very superficial. just covering the very top layer of the cake. The Xerces Society has incredible resources available for those of you who might want to start a pollinator garden. They've got California specific resources, but if you're one of the folks that are on the talk tonight who is not from California, I bet they've got resources for your region as well. And the important thing there is coming up with these regional resources is making sure you're planting the right plants, right? Because we can have these good intentions of trying to help things out, but then we plant the wrong plants, and what if they're invasive or something like that? Oh gosh, that'd be horrible. So this is a way to make sure that you're going to be planting the right plants. And also the Monarch joint venture group is one that you can look up that has tons and tons of resources and has even more links to more citizen science projects that you might become involved in. So there's plenty of resources to learn more about monarchs and pollinators there. At a very local level, we've got the Resource Conservation District of San Diego is got some resources on their webpage about pollinator health. And they are a member of a consortium of organizations called the San Diego Pollinator Alliance. And for those of you who have been to the San Diego County Fair in past years, obviously, then you perhaps walked through the pollinator pathway that they've developed there, where you can get an idea of what a nice pollinator garden might look like in our region. And then clearly, if we're talking about native plants, then we better be talking about the San Diego chapter of the Native Plant Society, which again, has amazing resources available online for identifying the right sorts of plants, tips and tricks, different times of the year, and so forth. So plenty of guides and resources available in there. And then I also just want to give a shout out to one of my personal heroes. This is Paige Howarth. She's the Director of Invertebrate Care and Conservation over at the zoo. And she is really leading the charge both sort of philosophically and practically when it comes to conservation of a lot of the butterflies in San Diego County, and is doing fantastic work. And most notably, this report that is over here just came out, and she was the co-leader on this report. And this is something from the AZA, it's the American Association of Zoos. And what this is a consortium of zoos that are really striving to work together to help save animals from extinction. And specifically, this report has to do with the North American monarch. So check out the work that Paige is doing over at the zoo. She's an amazing woman. And finally, what can you do? You can support conservation with your votes and your wallet. And I really want to emphasize the votes side of this, because I try to give you very practical things that you can do to help all of these critters. And these are things, you know, that you can go out and you can do right now, more or less. But you know, a lot of these problems that are facing these critters are at a societal level scale. And so we really need a societal level response to them. And so we're not talking about presidential politics and stuff like that. We're really talking about things like at the county level, because San Diego has a fantastic management and monitoring program that is funded with your tax dollars, the San Diego Management and Monitoring Program. And they're looking at pollinator conservation. They're looking at the conservations of the California gnatcatchers. They're really working to maintain the biological integrity of this place that we call home. Well, and that's funded through the government. So anytime something's funded through the government, then there's government oversight. And that means that there's elected officials that come into play. So really I would encourage you to challenge your elected officials about what are they doing to help with the biodiversity crisis that is facing us. And so with that, I would say thanks and support the NAT. And I'll turn it over to Judy.
Thank you, Michael. Virtual applause. And I do want to start by mentioning we will follow up, if you registered for this talk, with some of the links that Michael talked about, in addition to our inevitable post-talk survey, so that we can continue to improve on our talks. But that was absolutely excellent. While our elves are sorting the questions for me, I'm going to start with a quick question for Michael. I know how hard it is to take good pictures on iNaturalist, and what tips do you have for people who want to help with your Bumblebee project?
Yeah, bumblebees are particularly tricky because they fly around really fast and they tend not to cooperate, and you might be skittish about them possibly stinging you, though they're generally quite gentle and not aggressive at all. But the nice thing, at least about bumblebees within San Diego, is we've got a really limited number of species of them, and they are can be identified even from blurry photographs, as long as we have photographs from lots of different angles. So I wouldn't worry so much about getting one perfect photograph, because one perfect photograph might not show all the different color patterns on their head and on their back and in between their wings. Instead, take multiple blurry photos, and that will be fine, actually. So don't be shy about feeling like you can only post your best work. We'll take blurry photos on our iNat project.